Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've got the go-ahead signal, so I will start. Firstly, welcome, and thank you for taking the time out to come and listen to us. And thank you to Art Basel to make this conversation possible. My name's Hammad Nasar. I'm Head of Research and Programs at Asia Art Archive here in Hong Kong, and have also had a background in curatorial projects that look at Pakistan and India. Sitting to my left is Natasha Ginwala, an independent curator and writer based in Berlin, who is the curatorial advisor for the project that you see on the screen. This will be a presentation at Venice of a collateral project that is a combined project between India and Pakistan, which Natasha will share with us later. And sitting to her left is the artist Jitish Kallat, based in Bombay, who was here last time round in his curatorial guise, because he is also the curator of the current Kochi Muziris Biennale, and he'll be sharing some of his art projects with us. The structure of the talk is going to be something like this. Natasha will start us off, tell us a little bit about the project at Venice. Jitish has a long-standing practice that engages with many of those themes and will share some of those projects with us. I'll then swap hats for a few minutes and share some of the curatorial projects that I've been involved in that talk to the same theme. And then we'll talk amongst ourselves for a little while, and we'll continue doing that until you interrupt us with some questions of your own. And if you don't, we'll continue talking until we're told to leave the stage. But to get us going and to actually sort of ground this into the reality a little bit, I wanted to ask my panelists, given that our East is somebody else's West, as to how many times, if at all, they have been to your West, in fact. So Natasha, Pakistan experience?
I was fearing this question very much. The fact is that I haven't been as yet. I was meant to visit Pakistan last year, working on the Berlin Biennale, and with the curator Juan Gaitan. And I will also show that it was the first edition in which we had Indian and Pakistani artists in the Berlin Biennale history, but it was not possible logistically, because also this was the time when there was a lot of political disturbance. It was last summer, and summer before last, sorry. And we will be having a public program in Lahore, which we are already in discussion about. So that is also something that I will indicate.
So it's in the making. Jitish?
Shamefully, that applies to me too. I mean, and it's partly been just circumstances. I mean, there were invitations at times when I was committed elsewhere, but there was also moments when I really want to go, when we have had the parliament attacks and things like that, where it became impossible to go to Pakistan. So it's just been sort of unfortunate. I really haven't been.
And sort of mea culpa here, I've been to India once, not for lack of trying, but there is an issue around visas. So there is a privilege of being born in Lahore, which costs you when you apply for visas, whatever your passport is. And this is partly show, but I think it was also just to try and anchor it into the reality, which is about how we may share histories, but actually sharing the present is much, much harder. And with that, perhaps, Natasha, I'll ask you to start and tell us a little bit about the project.
Thank you very much. And also it's a privilege to share this panel with very esteemed colleagues whom I've admired since I was a student. So thank you for this opportunity at Basel. So this project, My East is Your West, has been initiated by a Delhi-based foundation called the Gujral Foundation, led by the arts patron Feroz Gujral. It is a collateral event officially of the 56th Venice Biennale and not a national pavilion. And I find this a very important thing to first gesture towards, because it becomes essential as part of the premise to launch such a unprecedented effort. The reason being that there isn't a permanent national presence, and definitely not this sort of joint presence. It necessarily has to be an unofficial way in which a sense of hybrid belonging, a sense of dealing not just with this modernist legacy of partition, but of more also the geographic affinities, the cultural crossovers, the fact that we are working with two artists, Shilpa Gupta from Bombay, Rashid Rana from Lahore. They insist on us also insisting on talking about their cities, because their cities inspire them first. The fact that they've known each other for 10 years, they've been in projects together, but it's the first time to really, as a duet in some kinds, work in a shared space in Venice. So that's the starting point. Also to indicate that My East is Your West is a title that we borrowed from the work of Shilpa Gupta. It's a light installation piece and it's an ongoing work. Having trouble? Yeah, okay, thanks. So also wanted to share this image, which is a historic object, a seamless celestial globe, which was made under the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan by a metallurgist artisan called Muhammad Salih Tatavi. It's just an object that really inspired me in also understanding this sort of spherical issue of how this East-West need not be seen as a clear dichotomy or divide with fixed coordinates, but rather perhaps as a circulation of some kinds, an imaginative space where here you see the constellations presented as human-animal formations. And I found that quite inspiring. I'm just going to flip through some works of Shilpa and Rashid as I speak, just to familiarize you with the practices in case you don't know them already. Also, Shilpa's work can be seen at the fair. She works very much with emblems, one could say, of the national space. So also dealing with how transfiguration and translation can take place with these sort of emblems turning into materials, turning into inscriptions. So here the border as a ball of thread. Also the map as a field of resonance, something she's been working with, the hand-drawn, the handmade. Okay, not working. These are just some works by Shilpa, and Rashid, in a sort of different style, deals very much with the lives of images in a micro and macro scale, where this sort of fragmentation between, say, the bigger picture has imbibed within it multiple views that reveal an anachronism, and that anachronism. Here you see us switching over to Rashid's work. That anachronism can be revealed through the artist being interested in images that come from art history, from the architecture of Lahore, also from the internet. So there's very much this familiarity with aspects of architecture, the grid, aspects of miniature that Rashid has been well known to play with. I find this an important project to indicate, which is Shilpa Gupta and Huma Mulji's project, which happened in 2000 and 2002. It's called Ar-Par. It's interesting because, again, in this particular project, didn't want to go to the previous presentations of India or Pakistan historically in the 50s at Venice, but more talk about these sort of artist efforts, which are more informal ways in which to indicate a huge commitment towards one another's cultural work. And so here you have this public art exchange project where Shilpa and Huma involved 10 artists who literally had a sort of mail art project, one could say, posters that were then put in the civic spaces of the cities of Bombay and Karachi. Here you have Rashid Rana's work, who took part in the project. Just to flip through more work by Shilpa, also indicating the current interests of the artists. Shilpa has been working very much with the Bengal borderlands. I would say Bengal borderlands because it's not specifically the line of the border in this case. She's been traveling across different parts of this particular cartography. Again, this is a recent work of hers. She's been looking at how the Indo-Bangladesh region has had a very porous exchange so far, with an economy that is both informal, illicit, and extremely commercial as well. And how now with there's the largest border fence being built in the world across this particular border, and this is what she's currently preoccupied with. This is a field report image that Shilpa shared from Kuch Bihar when she made a trip while researching for the work she's doing in Venice. This also to indicate that with Rashid Rana, he's now shifting from the two-dimensional to the three-dimensional, playing even further with what it means to multiply perspectives, to play with aspects of mirroring, to double spaces, to make a sort of doppelganger where one is not in one place, but what it actually means to physically inscribe yourself in more than one space. This is a work of his at the Musée Guimet in the Asian collection, where he has his Desperately Seeking Paradise work mirroring across these various sculptures, and feel again it's a kind of clue towards what might be coming up. This is a work of Shilpa's at the Berlin Biennale, also to indicate these were both works that grew from the Dhaka Art Summit, again to say how important it is that artists are being represented in all kinds of formats to work across the region. This is Mariam Sohail in the Berlin Biennale, also to indicate again that she, as a Pakistani artist, we met in India, and after she moved there. So I've been meeting with artists from Pakistan in Dubai and India, and it's sort of, these are the ways I think we make loopholes to continue to work together. Just last minute from me is to say that we're having a South Asian public program. It was also important that this doesn't become an India-Pakistan sort of hyperbole of the binary, in fact, the worst of the conflict, the worst of the geopolitical conflict, but in fact, to make, again, this circulation of conversations. So I've named the platform Ancestors, and we are going to have a traveling program starting in Dhaka in March, at the end of March, and then Jaffna, where we will work with local organizations, Brito Arts Trust and the Sri Lanka Archive, as our local partners to make seminars and workshops. This just is a historic image of Asia as Pegasus from the 16th century, also to indicate what it means to remap South Asia away from a certain sort of Western imaginary and into a space where cosmological, decolonial, and planetary narratives can be discussed.
I think Ancestors seems to be a terrific baton-passing opportunity for Jitish. Because I think Jitish would love for you to share some of the works in which you are indeed engaging with ancestors, and then we'll sort of continue that conversation.
Thanks, Hammad. Thanks, Natasha, for this great opportunity to converse together. In fact, from what both of you were saying, there was this thought that both East and West are actually fallacies of our own imagination, especially looking at that image of the globe. And also, despite shared history, some of us can't navigate those geographies. But to me, well, the couple of works that actually emerged primarily out of my own doubts about a moment in time in India, but this was around about the time in the early 2000s when we had, as a rise of fundamentalism in the country, reflecting in certain pockets. Gujarat, the western state of Gujarat being one state where we had the worst communal riots I had actually encountered in my adult life. And in fact, that made me think of really where should one seek answers. And one of the places I felt I wanted to look at was really utterances and words spoken or written at the moment of independence itself. So this is a piece called Public Notice from 2003. And it's a speech delivered by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, at the midnight of Indian independence. In a way, thinking of what the nation might be in the future and how it might interact with a newly formed neighbor, a part of itself, an amputated part of itself, Pakistan. And in fact, the piece is actually this isn't moving. Is in fact 5 sheets which appear like large sheets of paper but essentially are mirrors on which the speech is hand inscribed and the mirror gets warped in a way because each letter in the speech is actually hand inscribed and set aflame. Almost, to me personally within the studio, it was almost like a re-emergence of the image of the flame, which we saw all through Gujarat, but in fact, was in fact like almost like a memory of the partition replayed. So each letter is sort of handwritten with an inflammable adhesive. It sets aflame, almost cremating Nehru's speech. And as this burns down into a sort of charred alphabet, it warps any image that might be in its presence at that moment in time. Public Notice 2 was a piece I made 4 years later, and it reflects back on a speech, in fact, spoken earlier by Mahatma Gandhi at what was then the inaugural moment of a march that he undertook to break a very brutal act called the SALT Act. It's also interesting to think that in 1930, when the Indian National Congress actually hoisted a flag declaring independence 17 years before the actual independence, they hoisted it in Lahore, present-day Pakistan. So in fact, 3 months later, Gandhi delivers this speech calling for complete civil disobedience, total non-violence, along with total non-cooperation, as he broke this act that denied Indians the right to make salt. He assumed he might be assassinated or arrested, and in anticipation, the speech calls for total restraint. And in a way, it's interesting also to think of how moments in the subcontinent are not specifically moments for only the subcontinent to reflect on. In fact, these words reincarnate in lives of Martin Luther King or in Mandela, and in fact resurface and reincarnate in other places around the world. And also maybe really tools for us to reflect on. So they take the form of these fossil relics that actually sit on these shelves. And it's really in the sort of after image of the alphabet after alphabet of almost these relics speaking back at you that I think there's an image that emerges from the text itself. So this is the last piece I'll kind of share very briefly. It's a recent piece called Covering Letter. And essentially when you walk into the room, what you see is an ascending piece of correspondence that rises in a descending film of mist. And as you step closer, you realize that it addresses you in first person, saying, "Dear friends, friends have been urging me to write to you for the sake of humanity." And the letter makes a 7-line pledge to rethink what you might do with your day or with your life vis-a-vis the world. And it's when the letter kind of leaves and departs that you actually see that the recipient of the letter was Hitler, and the author of that letter was Gandhi. And it's a letter that you can actually physically inhabit with your bodies, and when you do so, I wonder how we can play this. Can somebody click on it from the back? So when it, so this is how it appears, and in a way, to me, it's really interesting that this letter actually, while it is addressed to Hitler, seems like an open haiku to the rest of the world at any point in time. Certainly, it was obviously meant to probably make the British rethink what they were doing, but equally in India, with growing mistrust amongst communities leading up to partition, this could have as well been a voice across the subcontinent. And in a way, walking through the letter becomes, in a way, inhabiting perhaps the voice of one major proponent of peace to one recipient who's probably the greatest propagator of violence, both existing on the planet at that point in time, and kind of to be in between those metonyms is perhaps where covering letter is as a point of self-reflection.
Thank you, Jitish, and we'll sort of come back and try and sort of connect these two things. When we were initially having a conversation and thinking about what we want this conversation to be anchored on, one of the things that was very keen was to look and point to other initiatives, both curatorial but also artistic, that the current events are actually in dialogue with. And what I wanted to do, if I can get the pointer, and I can make this work. And if it doesn't work, every time I raise my hand, that means we need to move to the next slide. So start with actually what we think is the first ever collaboration between an Indian and a Pakistani artist. So this is Iftikhar Dadi and Nalini Melanie. And what they're creating, the piece is called Bloodlines. The lines that you actually see were the initial border between India and the bifurcated Pakistan in then time in two parts. East, which is now Bangladesh, and west, which is now currently Pakistan. And the piece, oops, too fast. The piece is actually made with sequins. And this is coming out of a project called Lines of Control, which started in 2005. And it gave the opportunity, as is in this case, to refabricate a piece which was lost. So it was originally made in 97, but was then remade in 2008. It also then put it in conversation with artists like Rashid Rana, who have been working in this theme for some time. So the image that you see here is a sort of a wall-sized, well, two wall-sized piece. It looks like a banal image of nationalism, people waving flags on a national day. They're looking above, so perhaps there are planes passing by. It's only when you go up close that you find that the actual images have been composed out of stills from Bollywood film. Bollywood film, which is actually at that time technically illegal in Pakistan, but at the same time, the most popular form of entertainment. So this idea of making your own self-portrait through the other it's a very playful, but also a very poignant hearing. So we had the old, the existing, and also the new. And in this piece, the Naeem Mohaymin, a Dhaka-born Bangladesh artist who will also be at this year's Venice Biennale. And this was a new commission for the project. And in this, he's really just compiled, he's pointing at things that exist. And these things are stamps. Each of those piles is by one of the nations that came out of the partition. Pakistan in front of you, India on the left, and Bangladesh on the right. The image is of the same person, Qazi Nazrul Islam, the poet, and each nation is claiming or sort of different genealogies and projecting different politics. It's the only instance of one person appearing on all three stamps. These came together in a series of exhibitions that were held in Dubai, in Karachi, in London. They were then brought together in various forms, in London at the British Council at the bottom, up in Bradford, just sort of examining this thing about India and Pakistan and how artists have been dealing with this. And then it went to Cornell, to the Johnson Museum, And at that time, it did two things. One, it expanded. So the point that Jitish just made about how the letters may have been specific and the context for Gandhi's speech may have been about partition, but it's really speaking to the world. And I think at Cornell, my colleague Iftikhar Dadi joined the curatorial team, and actually it expanded to many, many colleagues within Cornell faculty. Salah Hassan, I think, who will be speaking next here, among them, that actually looked at this idea of partition and living with our partitioned selves as actually a universal theme. That this is a piece by Rux, which looks at language and the idea of how partitions makes strangers of us all. And this then sort of puts the South Asia context in conversation through artistic practices coming out of West Asia, so decolonizing architecture. This is an imagining of the red line of the Oslo Accord. And on the far side, the sort of projection on the green sign that you see is actually the work of Jolene Rickard, a scholar and artist based in Cornell, who's dealing with Cornell's own history and the history of the Iroquois nation, whose land Cornell is actually built upon, but who are actually fighting for nationhood and recognition in the Supreme Court in the US. It has then moved on, and there'll be a lot of clicking going on, and you're not expected to read all of this, but the idea behind this, and I think the idea behind what Natasha was also saying, is that there's the African proverb of it takes a village to raise a child. And if you think about this project as a child, it's taken lots of villages all over the world to raise this particular one. It's consisted of talks, exhibitions, film screenings, and the scope of it has sort of expanded and brings into circulation, and it retains a currency. So even when you were talking, Natasha, there was an edge to that discussion about what this project is and how it's based. So it's not as if you're dealing with a long-forgotten past, that it is dead and buried, that is only relevant to historians of South Asia and area studies. It's an idea that actually finds lots of resonance and currency. And I'll end with just two sort of examples of how this currency exists. This is another project I was part of. It's called Where Three Dreams Cross. It was an attempt, a hugely ambitious, and other people can judge how successful attempt, at trying to map out a history of photography in what used to be India and is now India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And the only thing I'd point to is that this exhibition was possible in London and in Winterthur. It was not possible to travel this to India or Pakistan or Bangladesh for reasons of both politics as well as sort of infrastructure. The second project is one that my colleagues and I are currently embarking on at the Asiad Archive, where we're trying to compile a bibliography of art writing on modern and contemporary Indian art, and I emphasize Indian art, in 13 languages, 13 Indian languages, which include Tamil and Bangla and Urdu. But as you then start following these languages, the languages do not respect the same borders. So we are now following Tamil into Jaffna, and Bangla into Dhaka, and Urdu into Lahore. And as you follow these languages, it starts imploding that actual project of ours about Indian art, and starts asking ourselves question as to what is this history about. And I think that's where I'd like us to, perhaps with that question in mind, think about the two projects, well, your project in Venice and Jitish sort of flipping the hat and to your Kochi Muziris Biennial. Because in a way, both Venice and Kochi are situated on waters. You're dealing with, with the shore, you're dealing with flows, you're looking out into the world, and then you're also dealing with, certainly with Venice, people looking in. So I wanted to sort of start our conversation today with just sort of reflecting this, who's looking out to what, and then who are you inviting to look in? Perhaps, Jitish, if we can start with you for Kochi and then move to Natasha.
Yeah, I mean, with Kochi, Hammad, one of my first, and we had the very first conversation together. My first curatorial dialogue was actually with Hammad within weeks of actually taking on the project. My earliest reflections was really a thought that perhaps a place like Kochi can be a vantage point to look out. And so the analogy I often drew for the entire project was the notion of an observation deck, but equally the notion of a toolbox for self-reflection. So it's also this thought that perhaps on the shores at the Malabar coast, a point where between the 14th and 17th century, the world in fact converged, perhaps pegged on the image of the peppercorn as one object of attention and seeking, arrive and depart. In fact, in the process, dropping things like ballast stones that become part of Kochi architecture today. So in fact, these stones speak back through their presence, a history that has passed but is residually still visible. So in a way, the location became quite central as a possible vantage point from where we might reflect on our planet itself. I mean, Venice, of course, has a different texture altogether. And I often think of, I mean, when, say, for instance, Venice was instituted, 1897, was it? I mean, I wonder how many countries there were in the world. Or when in the Second World War, I think we had 100 countries in the world, you know, with sovereign status, national flags, etc. And maybe now we have 200 countries in the world. So you have, you know, the progressive sense of more passports, more national flags, more national anthems. And yet you have a peculiar environment where the whole notion of nation is progressively being erased. In fact, from 45 to now, through technology, movement, transactions of all kinds, progressively erasing the notion of the world. And yet you have these boundaries that become even more and more precious and difficult to traverse, to cross. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to be as articulate as possible, but it's a little bit difficult given that this project is still in the making. But to think more broadly of this looking out and looking in, I think what's most interesting for us right now is also that as the artists produce their work, they are also looking out very immediately through the frames of their studios. Like I said, Shilpa is looking at this certain sort of geography in which she too is a sort of outsider, to really think of these sort of spaces in which there is a condition of a no man's land, there is a question of rights being suspended. Shilpa very much deals with making trails of objects and conversations. She interviews lots of people while making work, so that looking out is a very intricate web of connections. And with Rashid, on the other hand, as you've also indicated, it is this sort of amazing and obsessive collecting of images and then of turning all of them turning them on their head in a way that all of the very sensitively thought through paradoxes of an everyday life and of a collective consciousness are indicated. And there is, like I said, this sort of space in which he brings Lahore virtually to us in Venice. And so that seems to be a position that can engage this looking in, looking out question. In Venice, it's also interesting for us to be looking out, of course, towards Okwenwezor's exhibition, which this time also deals with various forms of crisis and of world making, and thinking of what he says of the deep entanglements between history and the future. And that is what, it's quite exciting to be part of this particular edition, given the curator's own trajectory. And also given that there will be other projects, like there's particularly the Central Asian Pavilion, which I feel is a very interesting example of what it means to represent a region, in a sense. So looking out could mean these various things as well, one could say.
Just on that point, Jitish, in terms of your, because it is a very situated place where people in Lahore don't get their visas very easily too, but the people who do, so I mean there are several 100,000 people who visited Kochi, and only a small fraction of them are on the sort of the international global art circuit. What has been your observation of, or your sort of reflection or takeaway from people who are looking into your observation deck through these artworks that you've assembled from all over the world, but also from the region? What have you taken away from the people of Kerala who have responded to it, and how have they responded?
Kochi has, as you know, a very wide audience in numbers, but also a wide demography of audience. So, I mean, even within Kerala, it's hard to actually make an assessment of what is the audience in a singular or even in 2 or 3 forms or 2 or 3 categories. I mean, so I think it's really so wide in terms of, in fact, audiences with very minimal access to ideas of contemporary art come very, very equipped with awareness of history, deep commitment to notions of culture, social processes, and are politically very, very active. So these are extremely differently empowered viewership that you can address through a process such as the one in Kochi. So for me, it's been interesting that, and especially for a space like Kerala, World Explorations, which is the project that I conceived, in a way has multiple limbs through which one might, in fact, interrogate the present. And some of it calls for, in fact, a shift in optics that might occur from one room to the other. Sometimes a project might reflect back into the past, others might immediately project into the future, and yet again, there's this spatial, consistent departure from what might be a terrestrial narrative to an intergalactic view of the planet itself as something that's traversing alongside all of these narratives, all of these histories. I mean, so in a way, it continuously interrogates not specific social narratives, it does that too, but perhaps tries to read it against the grain of the perceptual hallucinations that we inhabit, even while we conduct our affairs in the world. I mean, for instance, we are feeling very static while we know we are extremely mobile. In Kochi, the earth moves at 1,500 kilometers per hour, faster than the speed of sound. So anyone speaking in Kochi essentially has their voice reaching their immediate neighbor slower than the earth having just traversed. Now this is beyond our perceptual limit. And it's in some ways at the heart of world explorations is in fact a reflection on what we don't know alongside the things that we think we know.
While we try and understand and parse out the many worlds in that exploration, a very basic question to you, Natasha. I think I really appreciate the program going to, say, Dhaka and to Jaffna, and I wonder in terms of why just South Asia? Why not sort of Borneo? Why not the cross straits between Taiwan or Hong Kong for that matter? Because I mean the sort of the impetus behind, if I can read it, is to make sure that it's not fetishized out of one particular border or out one particular thing. So did you think about sort of moving beyond South Asia?
I thought about it very much. It's also the fact that I'm located in between Berlin and India, and I value very much this process of even not turning the public program into a specific regional scope per se.
Berlin, for example, is a fairly interesting place for East and West.
Yes. The fact is also time and logistics, because to make a public program as a platform, the fact that Okwe had his platform, which of course didn't have this regional, it went to Delhi and Berlin and Lagos, and that was pioneering effort. I did think though that to be realistic to some extent, it was important to also use this time frame of Venice. I hope very much that Ancestors as a platform can travel much beyond the region, but the fact is, it was also important to use our process to say, okay, we're given 2 years in full. How do we map our processes of discussion across the region in this particular time? And therefore, we will be in Lahore, Jaffna, Dhaka, Delhi for now, and perhaps extend beyond, of course, in Venice, also the public program, but then hopefully beyond the time limit of 2 years, it can go to other regions as well.
I'm sort of conscious of time limits, and I think we'd like to open the conversation up to our audience. Somebody will find you with a mic.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask, I guess mainly Natasha, but I guess all three of you might have an opinion on it. I think based on the project that you're doing for Venice, and this to think a bit about kinds of value that I think you might be interested in, and symbolic value. Particularly when, as Jitish was sort of pointing out, that there are more and more nations and sort of borders change, and along with that, very often comes the consolidation of myths of national monoculture. But I think I'm just curious to sort of hear from you about this, what kind of symbolic value you hope to attain, particularly as people now are sort of looking for new kinds of how they understand what value is with art and culture beyond economic, just to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a bit of a tricky question. I feel a bit to talk about symbolic value in itself feels a bit of I don't know, a bit controversial almost. To even say this is the symbolic value, for instance, as a statement seems odd. But I think there are a lot of questions on the table. Actually, the fact that this project would be more of a blueprint, let's say, really it's more a pointing device, I would say, of what it means to have these two positions presented in this asymmetrical format, which is not the unilateral sovereign effort at all. And the work in itself also, importantly, is not talking about singularities of Pakistan and India. I think that in that sense, there is a multitude in terms of what value the project could generate. But it's also a blueprint, and that's very important. It's really a lot of people coming together, thinking that maybe through efforts like Kochi, for instance, where we announced the project, that there can be a journey that we map in our own collective interests in one another, and maybe in thinking about South Asia beyond the market, for sure. So all of those things maybe are what one would put on the table here.
I mean, in terms of value, Venice actually has an interesting proposition today, and I'm just thinking of like the Cartography of Venice Biennale, not Cartography of Venice itself, but that might in fact reflect on Venice's locations within a broader historical cartography of where it was located in time. In fact, what happens within the biennial, the cartography of the Biennale, if we actually try and articulate sites, I mean, the Giardini becomes the gardens, and almost like the pavilions almost have a sense of being birthday cakes in those environments, as opposed to, say, the Arsenale, a gathering site where art now takes space, where military, ballistic, maritime aspirations were worked upon for centuries. So in fact, we might actually think of what nations occupy what locations within this cartography. And in fact, for an ever-unfolding and ever-changing notions of present, understanding of center, periphery, those overused words, you actually see them replayed, in fact, depending on what nations take what positions within the cartography of the Biennale. So in fact, that is a valuable infrastructure, an intellectual infrastructure, to in fact rethink many, many things of our world today. So I think a proposition like My East is Your West actually can find a location within that cartography to articulate valuable things about the world.
And the one thing I'd add to that is actually the choice of artists is very important, in that both these artists have very long-standing engagements with many, many of these issues, stretching over multiple bodies of works across, many sort of projects and years. So I think that brings a certain depth and a sincerity of engagement that perhaps can, that people can sort of cut through the actual symbolic value of having a Pakistani and an Indian artist in there. No, I sort of take that point. Our next question. So while we're waiting for that next question, Natasha, let me ask you another question, which is, when this idea was proposed to you, I don't know the quite mechanics of how it came about. So the idea, we understand my East is your West. Just the title is so wonderful and beautiful. It's evocative. And when it is placed in Venice with all its loaded sort of yacht parking accoutrements that the biennial as part of a circuit has, what were your biggest doubts? What were your concerns?
So first, it would be important to mention that the project is conceptualized in terms of this potential of an India-Pakistan joint presentation is very much conceived by Feroz Gujral, our founding patron, and as director of the Gujral Foundation, along with Rashid. So that was also interesting because when they met at the last edition of Venice, where suddenly there was no official India pavilion after having one curated by Ranjit Hoskote, they jointly thought about the fact that what if? So it started with this what if there was, and then a lot of us joined into that effort. And it's ongoing. So in that sense, the concerns, I don't even know where to start actually in terms of what, because we're so close now. This is such a, you know what I mean? It's such an odd moment because we cannot go back to the beginning. And
you cannot reveal what's going to be coming.
No, but also the shore is so close now. Let's say the shores of Venice, it's sort of there now, very close. So I think it's more this becoming of the project. We're all very anxious about what this perception of the project will be because, as I said, it's the first time. So there's maybe a level of anticipation that also will never occur again. That's a concern. The first time of what does it actually mean? And if, for whatever reason, it becomes problematic, then also how will we have a shared conversation? I think that's a concern, also for me personally, of how will we reflect upon this first effort?
Question in the front row.
Hi. There's a question I asked a little bit earlier, but it's interesting to me, and I don't know whether you have the answer to it, but it's interesting to me that this is a private initiative to bring India and Pakistan to the Venice Biennale. And as I firmly believe, some of the best and most cutting-edge initiatives often come out of the private imagination, as opposed to the public imagination as institutionalized by national pavilions and the rest of it. I was wondering, however, because it is on the world map, on the world art map, and it does have, it's a fairly charged idea, particularly with what's going on geopolitically and economically in that part of the world and then globally. Has there been an official, either Pakistan or Indian reaction to this? Has it caught the public imagination as we read it through the media? I was just wondering what that was.
So one first comment to that question, I would mention that in this project, what has been personally interesting is to observe what are the levels of private engagement. Because also when we talk about the private sphere supporting a project, it's really encouraging to think that when this scale of a project is launched by a particular foundation, which is quite young, then how that foundation can also reach out to various players in this private realm, or even encourage new cultural patrons to participate, to add on. And that hopefully can also be a way in which new formations of institutional activity, at least, if not institutions, are born. Also same for Kochi, it's very interesting how once you take the leap, then what actually becomes possible in terms of support from this private imagination. Also then in terms of the short answer, which is the public reaction, there has been, again, Firoz Gujral, she's been extremely active in reaching out to public institutions, also trying to support public institutions such as the NGMA, etc. So in that sense, there's a conversation, but the conversation does not rise to the surface or to the mainstream media. We have a lot of press for the project, but then there would be, say, one official comment.
And what does that comment say?
In The Guardian, we had an article, and it was an official comment that stated, in this quite mediocre way, the fact that this is futile before it even happens. Basically because the geopolitical relations are frozen to the extent that Peshawar had happened, and so it was sort of, what is this futility actually of even attempting this sort of joint project?
I don't want to end on a note of futility, but unless there are other questions which are burning there, I think we might have to, because otherwise we're going to run into the next panel's time. So it just leaves me to say thank Natasha and Jitish for joining us here, and thank you for doing the same. Thank you.